Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a world where rivers could be both generous friends and silent executioners. A world where entire civilizations depended on water for survival, yet feared it every single season. Long before satellites tracked storms, before concrete dams restrained mighty currents, and before engineers calculated flood levels with remarkable precision, ancient people watched the skies with anxious eyes. They understood something that modern societies sometimes forget. Water never truly belongs to humanity. At any moment, it can reclaim everything. Tonight, we follow the forgotten stories of history's deadliest floods. Some destroyed prosperous kingdoms. Others erased villages so completely that only layers of mud remained to tell archaeologists that people had once lived there. Many disasters left no written survivors at all. Instead, they survived through legends, myths, temple inscriptions, broken pottery buried beneath thick sediments, and the quiet testimony of ancient landscapes. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. Now, dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that perfect background hum, and let us slowly drift together into one of history's most relentless natural forces. The first thing to understand is that ancient floods rarely arrived without warning. Yet recognizing those warnings was another matter entirely. Rivers often behaved predictably for decades. Farmers memorized seasonal rhythms. Children grew into adults, believing that next year's waters would resemble last year's. Communities built homes where generations before them had safely lived. Confidence slowly replaced caution. Then nature changed its mind. Unlike earthquakes, floods often unfolded gradually enough for people to witness their own approaching catastrophe. Dark clouds gathered over distant mountains beyond the horizon. Tributaries quietly carried increasing amounts of muddy water. Riverbanks softened. Floating branches drifted downstream. Livestock became restless. Birds abandoned low wetlands. Most people hoped the river would soon calm. Instead, it continued rising. One of humanity's earliest great civilizations depended almost entirely upon such uncertain water. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, southern Mesopotamia appeared at first glance to be an unlikely place for civilization. Rainfall remained scarce throughout much of the year. Natural forests were limited. Summers became intensely hot. Yet these rivers transformed dry plains into fertile agricultural land, unlike almost anywhere else in the ancient Near East. Every harvest depended upon irrigation canals. Every city depended upon careful water management. Every ruler understood that controlling rivers meant controlling prosperity itself. Ancient workers dug canals with astonishing determination. They constructed embankments using baskets of mud and reeds. Generations maintained levees by hand, year after year. There were no bulldozers, no reinforced concrete, only thousands of laborers carrying earth beneath an unforgiving sun. Their work usually succeeded. Usually, the rivers flowing from distant mountains possessed personalities that local farmers could never fully control. Heavy rainfall hundreds of kilometers upstream might remain invisible for days. Snow melting far beyond the horizon gradually increased river discharge long before any messenger could arrive carrying news. By the time unusual water levels became obvious, valuable time had already disappeared. Imagine waking before sunrise in an ancient Mesopotamian farming village around 5,000 years ago. The air already feels warm. Irrigation ditches glisten softly beneath the first light. Children gather clay jars while older relatives prepare simple morning meals. Fishermen untie small reed boats. Farmers inspect barley fields, expecting another ordinary day. Someone notices the river. It seems slightly higher. Nothing alarming. Perhaps yesterday's rainfall upstream. Hours pass. The current grows noticeably faster. Floating reeds race downstream instead of drifting lazily. Water presses harder against canal walls. Experienced elders exchange uncertain glances, but continue working. Rivers often fluctuate. By afternoon, concern quietly spreads. Water now laps against embankments, never meant to become submerged. Livestock hesitate before drinking. Dogs bark unusually often. Children sense adult anxiety despite receiving reassuring smiles. Nobody panics. Not yet. Then comes the sound. Modern disaster survivors often describe floods by emphasizing the noise before the water itself arrives. Ancient witnesses probably experienced something remarkably similar. A distant roar, low at first, gradually growing louder. Not thunder, moving water, an entire landscape beginning to shift. The first levee collapses. Mud gives way. Water discovers a weakness no wider than a doorway. Within moments, that opening doubles, then triples. The current tears away baskets of earth assembled through months of exhausting labor. Reed reinforcements disappear instantly. The breach widens faster than anyone can repair it. Men rush forward, carrying shovels. Others drag woven baskets filled with fresh soil. Women gather children. Neighbors shout instructions, almost impossible to hear above the increasing roar. The river has made its decision. Once floodwater escapes confinement, everything changes astonishingly fast. Irrigation canals become uncontrolled torrents flowing in unexpected directions. Fields disappear beneath opaque brown water, carrying branches, livestock, broken tools, and sections of collapsed buildings. Mud brick houses begin absorbing moisture immediately. Unlike modern fired bricks, many ancient homes relied upon sun-dried mud blocks. Strong during ordinary weather, these materials gradually weakened once saturated. Walls softened, corners crumbled, roof supports shifted. Entire homes sometimes collapsed while still standing. Residents hurriedly removed whatever possessions they could carry. Grain stores, clay tablets, cooking pots, blankets, family heirlooms. Everything else remained behind. Some climbed onto rooftops, believing higher ground offered safety. Others fled toward temple platforms built slightly above surrounding neighborhoods. Wealthier families owning boats possessed obvious advantages. Most people simply walked as quickly as conditions allowed. Hopping the water would not rise faster than exhausted legs could carry them. For city administrators, floods represented something even more frightening than immediate destruction. Records vanished, taxes disappeared, harvests failed, canals clogged with sediment, labor forces scattered, trade stopped. The economic consequences often lasted years after floodwaters retreated. Ancient rulers frequently presented themselves as protectors chosen by the gods specifically to maintain order against natural chaos. Temple inscriptions celebrated kings who repaired canals, strengthened embankments, and restored irrigation networks following destructive floods. These texts naturally emphasized royal success rather than failure, yet they indirectly reveal how frequently such disasters occurred. Repair became a permanent responsibility. Archaeologists excavating several Mesopotamian settlements have repeatedly discovered thick layers of river sediment separating periods of continuous occupation. These deposits do not necessarily represent one enormous flood covering the entire region simultaneously. Instead, they reflect numerous local catastrophes unfolding across centuries. One community rebuilt while another vanished forever. A prosperous town became abandoned. Nearby villages survived. History rarely moves uniformly. Neither do rivers. Some of these flood deposits became so memorable that later generations transformed them into stories explaining humanity's relationship with divine power. Mesopotamian flood traditions eventually influenced broader narratives throughout the ancient Near East. Although myths should never be read as straightforward historical reports, many scholars believe repeated experiences with devastating regional floods helped shape collective memory over countless generations. When disasters repeat often enough, memory becomes tradition. Tradition becomes legend. Legend sometimes survives long after the original events fade. Yet even the most resilient societies struggled against another hidden consequence of flooding. Disease. Stagnant pools formed after rivers retreated. Drinking water became contaminated. Food supplies spoiled beneath wet conditions. Mosquitoes multiplied. Livestock carcasses remained trapped beneath thick mud. Medical knowledge remained limited, while sanitation systems frequently suffered severe damage. Many people who escaped drowning still faced dangerous weeks afterward. Recovery required patience, exceeding the disaster itself. Fields covered by fresh sediment occasionally became remarkably fertile once properly managed. This strange paradox lay at the heart of many ancient river civilizations. The same floods that destroyed homes could eventually nourish future harvests. Communities therefore faced impossible choices: abandon productive floodplains and lose agricultural abundance, remain beside unpredictable rivers, and accept recurring danger. Again and again, humanity chose the rivers. The decision made perfect sense. Without reliable water, civilization itself became nearly impossible. As generations passed, engineers improved canals, laborers strengthened embankments, administrators organized maintenance schedules, priests interpreted unusual natural signs, farmers adjusted planting seasons whenever possible. Each improvement reduced certain risks. None eliminated them completely. Far upstream, beyond every city and every kingdom, storms continued forming over distant mountains where no local official exercised authority. Rain continued falling according to atmospheric patterns nobody understood. Snow accumulated through winter before melting during warmer months. Nature patiently prepared the next test. Far to the southwest, another extraordinary river quietly followed a rhythm unlike those of Mesopotamia. For thousands of years, it would sustain one of history's longest-lasting civilizations. Yet every summer, its waters concealed enormous uncertainty beneath their seemingly dependable cycle. Most years, the flood arrived almost like a blessing. Some years, however, that blessing grew far beyond human expectation, and when the great river called the Nile forgot its usual boundaries, entire communities discovered that even predictable rivers could suddenly become terrifying. The Nile followed a rhythm that seemed almost comforting. Unlike the restless Tigris and Euphrates, whose floods could arrive with unsettling unpredictability, Egypt's great river usually rose according to a familiar seasonal pattern. Every summer, rains falling far to the south in the Ethiopian highlands gradually worked their way northward. Weeks later, the river began to swell, spreading rich black silt across fields that would soon produce abundant harvests. Egyptian life revolved around this dependable cycle so completely that the calendar itself reflected the annual inundation. Generations grew accustomed to measuring the river's height with remarkable care. Priests and officials observed specially constructed nilometers, recording how high the water climbed each year. A flood that remained too low threatened drought and poor harvests. A flood that rose too high threatened homes, storehouses, roads, and lives. Prosperity existed within a surprisingly narrow balance. Most years, the Nile remained within that balance. Occasionally, it did not. Imagine a farming settlement somewhere along the river around 3,500 years ago. The morning begins with quiet confidence. Families have watched the river gradually rise for several weeks, exactly as expected. Children laugh while chasing one another along elevated paths. Fishermen prepare woven nets, knowing that floodwaters often bring abundant fish. Farmers discuss the coming planting season, already planning which plots will receive fresh silt first. The river appears healthy, strong, generous. No one suspects that far upstream, rainfall has exceeded anything witnessed in recent memory. Hundreds of kilometers away, mountain valleys have collected torrents of water. Streams have merged into rushing rivers. Countless tributaries feed the Nile with relentless determination. None of the people living downstream can see these distant storms. They possess no weather forecasts, no telegraph, no messenger capable of outrunning the river itself. They only see the water rising. Day after day, the familiar shoreline slowly disappears. Wooden posts marking previous flood levels vanish beneath the surface. Boats tied securely one evening float far higher by sunrise. Riverbank vegetation bends beneath an increasingly powerful current. Experienced elders begin comparing the river with floods remembered during their youth. Some insist they have seen worse. Others quietly admit they have not. The conversations remain calm, yet a subtle uneasiness settles over the village. People begin carrying valuable belongings onto higher shelves. Clay jars filled with grain are moved toward elevated storage rooms. Livestock are gathered more closely together, just in case relocation becomes necessary. No one wishes to appear frightened, but everyone keeps watching the river. The Nile possesses a deceptive quality during large floods. At first, its expansion seems almost graceful. Water gently spreads across low fields, exactly as farmers expect. Irrigation basins fill one after another. Small channels overflow with little more than a soft ripple. Then the pace changes. Instead of slowing, the water continues advancing. Low footpaths disappear beneath shallow currents. Areas that should remain dry become marshy. Wells fill with muddy water. The boundaries separating farmland from settlement begin to blur. People who have spent their entire lives reading the river recognize that something unusual is happening. The flood has exceeded memory. Village leaders organize hurried discussions beneath shaded courtyards. There is no panic, only practical questions. Which families should relocate first? Which animals can be moved to higher ground? Which food stores require immediate protection? Every decision carries consequences. Leaving too early wastes valuable labor if the river soon retreats. Waiting too long risks becoming trapped. Ancient Egyptian homes, like many throughout the ancient world, often relied upon sun-dried mud bricks. These buildings performed remarkably well under ordinary conditions. Thick walls kept interiors cool during scorching summers and retained warmth during cooler nights. Prolonged exposure to floodwater told a different story. As moisture soaked into lower walls, the bricks gradually weakened. Small cracks widened. Corners began crumbling. Wooden roof beams shifted as supporting walls softened beneath their weight. A house that had sheltered several generations could suddenly become unsafe within only a few days. Families worked tirelessly to reinforce vulnerable structures. Additional mud was packed around foundations. Wooden supports were wedged beneath sagging roofs. Reeds were tied together to strengthen weakened walls. Sometimes these efforts succeeded. Sometimes they merely delayed collapse. Meanwhile, the flood transformed familiar landscapes into confusing waterways. Roads vanished beneath brown water. Field boundaries disappeared completely. Places where children once played now required boats for travel. Farmers accustomed to walking directly between neighboring villages found themselves navigating unfamiliar channels. The landscape itself seemed to dissolve. Egyptian officials depended upon orderly taxation based largely upon agricultural production. Surveyors carefully measured fields after each flood because shifting sediments frequently altered property boundaries. During exceptionally large inundations, these measurements became far more difficult. Markers disappeared, canals changed course, entire sections of farmland became impossible to identify until the water receded. Administration slowed as uncertainty spread across the countryside. For ordinary villagers, however, paperwork mattered far less than survival. Food required protection from moisture. Firewood had to remain dry. Drinking water became increasingly precious because floodwater often carried mud, decaying vegetation, and animal waste. Even simple cooking became difficult when dry fuel disappeared beneath rising water. Daily routines quietly unraveled. Morning chores took twice as long. Simple journeys became exhausting. Sleep grew restless. Everyone listened for unusual sounds during the night. Ancient Egypt possessed one important advantage, unavailable to many other civilizations. Boats formed an ordinary part of everyday life. The Nile served as the kingdom's principal highway, carrying merchants, officials, priests, soldiers, and travelers between distant settlements. Many communities therefore possessed boats capable of transporting families or supplies during emergencies. Yet boats solved only part of the problem. They could move people. They could not stop the river. As floodwaters lingered, another challenge gradually emerged. Stored grain, if exposed to damp conditions for too long, spoiled. Mold spread quietly through baskets that appeared perfectly normal from the outside. Rodents sought refuge on the same elevated ground as humans, contaminating precious food reserves. Insects multiplied wherever stagnant pools remained after the strongest currents passed. Recovery became more difficult with every passing week. The remarkable resilience of Egyptian civilization often gives the impression that it remained untouched by natural disaster. Monumental temples still stand. Massive pyramids continue dominating the landscape. Royal inscriptions celebrate victories religious ceremonies, and successful harvests. They speak less often about ordinary people repairing damaged homes after severe floods. Yet archaeology tells a quieter story. Excavations at numerous ancient settlements reveal repeated rebuilding. Floors were raised to compensate for accumulating sediments. Walls were reconstructed using fresh mud bricks. Streets changed direction over generations as people adapted to subtle shifts in the landscape. These gradual alterations remind us that survival required constant maintenance rather than permanent security. Nature demanded regular negotiation. Every successful harvest encouraged people to remain beside the river. Despite its occasional violence, the benefits remained irresistible. Fresh silt renewed exhausted soil. Reliable water supported large populations. Trade flourished along navigable waterways. Abandoning the Nile would have meant abandoning the very foundation of Egyptian civilization. So generation after generation rebuilt what floods damaged. Children grew into adults hearing stories about unusually high water years remembered by parents and grandparents. Those memories became practical lessons rather than dramatic legends. Families learned which hills remained safest. They remembered where boats should be stored. They recognized which buildings endured previous floods most successfully. Experience became a form of protection. Not perfect protection, but valuable nonetheless. Far beyond Egypt, however, another civilization faced water from an entirely different direction. There, danger did not always arrive through slow seasonal swelling. Instead, violent monsoon rains crashed across mountain valleys, overwhelming rivers with astonishing speed. Dense forests echoed with thunder, while torrents carved fresh paths through fertile plains. Communities living near the great rivers of the Indus Valley had developed impressive cities with carefully planned streets, sophisticated drainage systems, and remarkable engineering. Even so, they too would discover that the most carefully designed settlements could still be humbled by water when the skies refused to stop raining. The cities of the Indus Valley appeared astonishingly organized for their time. Long before many other parts of the ancient world developed carefully planned urban centers, builders here laid out streets in neat grids, constructed standardized baked bricks, and designed drainage systems that remain impressive even today. Visitors arriving from distant lands would likely have admired the orderliness of these settlements. Straight roads intersected one another with remarkable precision. Wells stood close to homes. Public baths reflected both engineering skill and social importance. Everything suggested stability, yet stability often creates an illusion of permanence. The people who lived in these cities understood rivers intimately. Their prosperity depended upon them. The mighty Indus and its many tributaries carried fertile sediment from towering mountains far to the north. Seasonal rains nourished crops that supported populations numbering in the tens of thousands. Merchants transported goods along waterways connecting distant communities. Potters shaped clay gathered from riverbanks. Farmers timed their labor according to changing water levels. The river gave generously. It also remembered no promises. Unlike Egypt, where much of the annual flooding followed a comparatively familiar rhythm, the rivers of the Indus Basin could respond dramatically to the South Asian monsoon. Some years brought moderate rains that replenished reservoirs and refreshed farmland. Other years, the skies seemed determined never to clear. Storm after storm crossed the mountains, feeding countless streams that joined larger rivers already running high. No single village could observe the entire process. People witnessed only the final result. Imagine standing atop the flat roof of a brick house in one of the larger Indus cities. The air feels unusually heavy. Thick clouds hide the sun for much of the day. Rain has fallen repeatedly for nearly a week, sometimes gently, sometimes with astonishing force. The streets below remain passable, though puddles linger longer than usual. Children splash through shallow water, while adults continue their daily routines, convinced that the weather will soon improve. After all, rain is expected during the monsoon. It has always come. It has always ended. This year proves different. Small drainage channels that usually carry water away efficiently begin filling faster than they can empty. Courtyards remain damp. Storage rooms require constant attention to keep valuable grain dry. Artisans working with clay struggle as excess moisture slows their work. Merchants postpone departures because river crossings have become increasingly dangerous. Life continues, but cautiously. Outside the city, farmers notice something more troubling. Fields closest to the river remain underwater far longer than expected. Livestock avoid certain grazing areas because the ground has turned soft and unstable. Trees along the banks lean awkwardly as fast-moving currents gradually erode the soil beneath their roots. The river is changing shape. No one knows how far that change will continue. As another night falls, rain drums steadily upon flat rooftops. Families gather indoors, speaking quietly while listening to water flowing through the city's drainage system. The sound is familiar, almost comforting. These drains represent one of the city's greatest achievements. Built with careful planning, they have carried away countless storms before. Tonight they struggle. Water begins backing up into smaller lanes. Courtyards fill more quickly than they empty. Residents remove sandals before wading through ankle-deep water that had not been there an hour earlier. Some laugh nervously. Others stop laughing altogether. Before dawn, word spreads that the river has overtopped part of its natural bank beyond the western fields. At first, the news seems distant. Many city residents cannot even see the affected area. They trust that the open floodplain will absorb much of the excess water. Instead, the floodplain becomes the pathway, a broad sheet of muddy water advances steadily toward cultivated land. It carries uprooted shrubs, broken branches, and fragments of fencing. Farmers rush to free animals tethered near low ground. Oxen pull carts loaded with sacks of grain, while families carry whatever possessions they can manage. The movement is purposeful rather than frantic. There is still time, or so everyone believes. By midday, the river has become almost unrecognizable. The calm channels that merchants navigated only weeks earlier have merged into a vast expanse of churning brown water. Familiar islands disappear beneath the surface. Sandbanks vanish completely. The current no longer follows yesterday's course. It creates its own. Water seeks every weakness. It slips through abandoned irrigation ditches, follows shallow depressions across the landscape, and presses relentlessly against embankments built through years of patient labor. Each barrier holds for a while, then one fails, not with an explosion, not with a dramatic crack, simply with the quiet surrender of saturated earth. A narrow opening appears. The current widens it almost immediately. Soon, an entire section of bank collapses into the river, releasing another powerful surge toward the surrounding countryside. Within the city, officials attempt to maintain order. Craftsmen are asked to reinforce vulnerable walls. Workers clear blocked drains as quickly as possible, removing debris carried by fast-moving water. Families living in lower neighborhoods relocate temporarily to higher sections of the settlement where streets remain comparatively dry. The city's design delays disaster. It cannot prevent it forever. Archaeologists studying several Indus Valley sites have uncovered repeated layers of flood deposits separating different phases of occupation. Thick blankets of silt settled across streets, once carefully swept clean. Homes were rebuilt directly atop earlier foundations. In some places, entire neighborhoods were razed to compensate for repeated flooding. Each rebuilding project tells a quiet story. Someone survived. Someone returned. Someone decided that beginning again remained preferable to abandoning the city. Yet repeated floods carry costs beyond broken buildings. Trade suffers. Merchants hesitate to travel uncertain routes. Wagons cannot cross saturated ground. Boats face dangerous currents. Goods intended for distant markets remain trapped in warehouses. Communities that depend upon regular exchange begin experiencing shortages of materials they cannot produce themselves. Copper arrives late. Timber becomes scarce. Stone is harder to obtain. Even a city spared the worst, flooding, feels the consequences when transportation falters. Water also transforms the invisible world beneath people's feet. Wells that once supplied clean drinking water become contaminated by muddy floodwater. Waste carried through drainage channels mixes with standing pools. Food spoils more easily in humid conditions. Illness spreads quietly from household to household, often long after the river has begun retreating. To later generations, the flood may appear to have ended. For those living through it, the hardship continues. Months pass before damaged workshops resume normal production. Potters must replace ruined clay. Brickmakers wait for dry conditions to fire new construction materials. Farmers carefully inspect fields, discovering that some have benefited from fresh sediment, while others have been buried beneath thick layers of coarse sand, unsuitable for immediate cultivation. Nature does not distribute consequences equally. One family enjoys an unusually productive harvest. Another loses everything. Modern researchers continue debating the many factors that contributed to the gradual transformation of the Indus civilization. Climate shifts, changing river systems, evolving trade networks, and social adaptations all likely played important roles. Flooding alone cannot explain such a complex historical process. It did, however, shape daily life in profound ways. Every generation learned to live with uncertainty. Every child grew up understanding that the river providing food today might erase familiar landmarks tomorrow. As decades turned into centuries, communities adapted with remarkable resilience. Streets were elevated. Buildings were reconstructed. New settlements appeared where older ones had become increasingly vulnerable. Human ingenuity repeatedly answered nature's challenges, but nature always asked new questions. Far to the east, another great civilization watched enormous rivers descend from distant mountains toward broad, fertile plains. There, the waters of the Yellow River carried astonishing quantities of fine yellow silt, making the current appear almost golden beneath the afternoon sun. That beautiful color concealed one of the most dangerous rivers in human history. For thousands of years, the Yellow River would earn a reputation unlike almost any other waterway on Earth. Its floods could alter entire landscapes, shift channels across vast distances, and overwhelm communities that believed themselves safely beyond danger. The next chapter of our journey begins beside those restless waters, where generations of ancient Chinese farmers discovered that sometimes the deadliest flood was not the one people remembered, but the one they believed could never happen again. The Yellow River possessed a reputation that inspired both gratitude and caution long before historians began recording its turbulent past. Stretching across northern China, it nourished fertile plains that supported growing populations, prosperous farming communities, and the foundations of some of East Asia's earliest states. Every harvest owed something to its waters. Every ruler understood its importance. Yet, unlike many other great rivers, the Yellow River carried an extraordinary burden invisible to those standing upon its banks. It carried the land itself. Each year, winds sweeping across the vast Les Plateaux lifted enormous quantities of fine yellow dust into the air. Rain eventually washed much of that loose soil into countless streams, which fed larger rivers flowing toward the Yellow River. By the time the water reached the plains, it had become thick with suspended sediment. The river looked almost opaque, its current colored like diluted clay rather than clear water. This fertile silt enriched farmland. It also created a problem that no ancient engineer could solve permanently. As the current slowed across flatter landscapes, much of the sediment settled onto the riverbed. Year after year, century after century, the bed gradually rose higher. Communities responded by strengthening embankments and raising levees. Farmers hauled basket after basket of earth. Laborers packed clay into protective walls. Entire villages participated in maintaining the barriers that separated ordinary life from disaster. For a time, the system worked. Then the river rose higher still. Imagine an early autumn morning on the northern plains, nearly 3,000 years ago. Mist drifts lazily across fields where millet has recently been harvested. Oxen pull wooden carts loaded with bundles of grain. Smoke curls gently upward from cooking fires as families prepare breakfast before another ordinary day. The river flows quietly nearby. Too quietly, experienced fishermen notice something unusual. Floating branches move faster than expected despite the river appearing calm from the surface. Along certain bends, the current presses hard against the outer bank, silently eating away at compacted earth hidden beneath the waterline. Most people never notice. The danger remains invisible. Far upstream, heavy rainfall has fallen continuously across mountain valleys. Hundreds of streams now feed the main river with relentless force. Every hour adds more water to a channel already struggling to contain itself. The river begins climbing. At first, only those responsible for maintaining the levees recognize the change. Wooden measuring stakes show that the water has risen another hand's width since yesterday. Workers inspect embankments more frequently, searching for damp patches that might reveal hidden seepage. One man places his palm against the earthen wall. It feels unusually wet. Others gather. They dig carefully into the outer slope. A thin stream trickles through. Not much, barely enough to fill a cup. Yet every experienced laborer understands what that small trickle means. Water has found a path. Immediate repairs begin. Fresh soil is carried from nearby pits. Woven reed mats are pressed against the damp area before more clay is packed tightly into place. Additional workers stamp the repair firmly beneath their feet, hopping to seal the leak before pressure from the river enlarges it. For several hours, the effort appears successful. The seepage slows, relief spreads, people return to other tasks. No one realizes that a second weakness has already formed farther downstream. Unlike stone, earth rarely fails all at once. Moisture slowly loosens compacted soil. Tiny tunnels develop beneath the surface where water quietly escapes. These hidden passages widen grain by grain until the surrounding ground can no longer support its own weight. Then everything changes in moments. A section of levee suddenly slumps inward. The river wastes no opportunity. Water explodes through the opening with astonishing force, carrying away earth faster than hundreds of workers could replace it. What begins as a narrow breach rapidly becomes a gap wide enough for entire carts to disappear. The roar reaches nearby villages before anyone sees the flood itself. People pause in confusion. Then someone points toward the river. A wall of muddy water races across the fields. Unlike seasonal flooding that gradually spreads over broad floodplains, a levee breach unleashes concentrated power. The escaping current behaves almost like a newly formed river, cutting directly across farmland toward the lowest ground available. Harvested crops disappear first. Bundles of grain float briefly before being swallowed beneath churning water. Wooden fences snap apart. Storage sheds collapse almost immediately. Animals react long before many humans do. Horses pull desperately against their ropes. Dogs bark continuously. Chickens scatter in every direction. Oxen, usually calm and deliberate, strain to escape rising water that reaches their knees within minutes. Families understand there is little time. Children are lifted onto carts. Elderly relatives are supported by younger arms. Whatever can be carried is taken. Whatever cannot must remain behind. No one argues over possessions. Survival becomes the only meaningful priority. The flood advances relentlessly through the settlement. Mud walls soften. Wooden doors burst inward as water presses against them. Cooking fires hiss into silence. Household tools tumble across floors before vanishing beneath opaque currents, carrying reeds, broken beams, and uprooted trees. By sunset, familiar roads no longer exist. The village has become a shallow lake interrupted only by rooftops and taller trees. Some residents find temporary refuge upon nearby hills. Others gather on stretches of naturally higher ground, watching helplessly as water continues flowing across land cultivated by their families for generations. There is little conversation, only quiet observation, and waiting. Waiting becomes one of the most difficult parts of surviving an ancient flood. During the disaster itself, everyone remains occupied. People rescue neighbors. They gather food. They search for missing animals. They construct temporary shelters. Afterward comes uncertainty. How long before the water retreats? Will the crops survive? Can homes be repaired? Has the well become contaminated? No one possesses immediate answers. Archaeological evidence from northern China reveals that repeated flooding shaped settlement patterns across many centuries. Some communities rebuilt repeatedly in the same location despite recurring disasters. Others gradually relocated toward more stable ground. Excavations occasionally uncover thick layers of silt covering ancient floors, preserving everyday objects exactly where their owners left them. A broken pottery bowl beside a doorway, grinding stones abandoned near a collapsed wall, charred seeds sealed beneath flood deposits. These ordinary objects tell remarkably human stories. Someone expected to return. Many probably did. Some perhaps never could. Ancient Chinese rulers increasingly recognized that controlling rivers carried enormous political significance. A successful harvest strengthened the state. Stable rivers encouraged trade and population growth. Floods, however, threatened not only individual communities, but confidence in leadership itself. Over time, stories emerged celebrating wise rulers who organized massive public works to manage dangerous waterways. Whether every legend reflects literal history remains uncertain. Yet, they reveal something important about ancient society. People expected leaders to confront the river. Ignoring floods was never considered acceptable. Thousands of laborers dug new channels, reinforced embankments, and removed accumulated sediment wherever possible. These projects demanded extraordinary coordination. Food had to be supplied, tools manufactured, workers organized across vast distances. Every improvement bought valuable time. None guaranteed permanent safety. The Yellow River possessed an unsettling habit that distinguished it from nearly every other great river of the ancient world. Sometimes it changed course altogether when enormous floods overwhelmed existing channels. The river occasionally carved an entirely new path across the plain. Communities that had once lived comfortably several kilometers from the main current suddenly found themselves beside its banks. Others discovered that their familiar river had vanished, leaving abandoned channels gradually filling with reeds and stagnant pools. Maps, had they existed, would have required constant revision. The landscape itself refused to remain fixed. Generations adapted as best they could. Children learned stories of earlier floods from grandparents who had witnessed them firsthand. Farmers memorized subtle signs, the unusual color of fast-moving water, the appearance of fresh cracks along levees, the behavior of birds abandoning low marshes before major storms. Experience became another form of engineering. It could not stop disasters, but it sometimes saved lives. Across the ancient world, a remarkable pattern had begun to emerge. Mesopotamia feared rivers descending from distant mountains. Egypt watched the dependable Nile with cautious respect. The cities of the Indus Valley endured powerful monsoon floods. Northern China struggled against a river carrying the very earth beneath its waters. Different civilizations, different climates, different landscapes, yet each discovered the same enduring truth. Human achievement could flourish beside rivers for centuries. It could also be transformed within a single season. Beyond these great river valleys, however, another kind of catastrophe waited along the coastlines of the ancient Mediterranean. There, the danger did not always arrive from overflowing rivers or endless rain. Sometimes it came from the sea itself. Without warning, the shoreline would suddenly retreat, exposing fish flopping helplessly upon the sand. Curious onlookers stepped forward to investigate the strange sight, unaware that the ocean was only gathering strength. Moments later, a towering wall of water would race back toward the land, bringing with it one of the most terrifying flood disasters the ancient world had ever experienced. The people living along the ancient Mediterranean coast understood the sea better than most inland communities ever could. It provided fish, connected distant kingdoms through trade, and carried ships laden with copper, olive oil, grain, timber, pottery, and precious textiles. Harbors bustled from sunrise until dusk. Sailors learned to read changing winds with remarkable accuracy. Fishermen recognized subtle differences in waves that revealed hidden reefs beneath the surface. The sea demanded respect, but it usually behaved according to familiar patterns. Storms arrived during certain seasons. Strong winds occasionally delayed voyages. Winter crossings carried greater risks than calm summer mornings. Experienced captains accepted these realities as part of ordinary life. There remained one danger, almost impossible to predict. Unlike hurricanes that gathered over days, or floods that slowly climbed riverbanks, the Mediterranean occasionally unleashed a catastrophe that offered almost no warning at all. The earth itself would move. Far beneath the seabed, enormous sections of the planet's crust constantly pressed against one another. Ancient people possessed no understanding of tectonic plates or fault lines. They simply knew that the ground sometimes trembled without explanation. Most earthquakes ended within moments, leaving frightened families sweeping fallen pottery from their floors before continuing their lives. Occasionally, however, an earthquake beneath the sea accomplished something far more dangerous. It lifted or lowered the seafloor by several meters in only seconds. The water above responded immediately. At first, nothing seemed unusual from the shore. Then something impossible happened. The sea began moving away. Imagine standing on the harbor of a prosperous Bronze Age port sometime around the second millennium before the Common Era. The morning has been pleasant. Merchants argue over prices, while dockworkers unload cargo from wooden ships. Children chase one another near the waterfront despite repeated warnings from parents. Fishermen repair torn nets beneath the shade of simple shelters built from timber and woven reeds. Without warning, the ground shudders. Clay jars topple. Stone walls groan softly. Birds explode into the sky. People stop whatever they are doing. Some instinctively step into open spaces. Others remain frozen, waiting for the trembling to end. Within less than a minute, the shaking fades. Relief begins replacing fear. Then someone notices the harbor. The water is disappearing. Ships resting comfortably beside wooden piers suddenly lean awkwardly as the sea withdraws beneath them. Anchors scrape across the exposed seabed. Fish flop desperately among rocks that moments earlier had been hidden beneath several meters of water. The harbor has become strangely silent. Curiosity spreads faster than alarm. Children run toward the newly exposed shoreline. Adults follow more cautiously. Many have never witnessed anything like this before. Some begin collecting stranded fish. Others simply stare in amazement at parts of the seafloor no human expected to see. Had they understood what was happening far beyond the horizon, every person would have fled immediately. The retreating water is not disappearing. It is gathering. The displaced sea is racing outward in every direction as an enormous wave stretching across many kilometers. Unlike ordinary ocean waves, which affect only the surface, this one involves nearly the entire depth of the water. Far offshore, ships may notice little more than an unusually gentle rise and fall. Closer to land, the situation changes dramatically. As the wave approaches shallow coastal waters, the immense energy carried across the open sea has nowhere to go except upward. The sea begins rising. Rapidly, those still standing on the exposed shoreline hear it before they see it. A distant roar, not thunder, not wind, something deeper, something steadily growing louder. People turn toward the horizon. At first, they struggle to understand what they are seeing. The lines separating sea and sky appear strangely uneven. Then they realize it is moving. Fast, very fast, a wall of water races toward the harbor. Panic erupts instantly. Parents scream for children. Dock workers abandon valuable cargo without hesitation. Merchants drop bags of silver, bronze tools, and carefully recorded accounts onto the ground, suddenly meaningless compared to survival. Everyone runs. Few know where safety truly lies. The first impact arrives with astonishing violence. The wave slams into anchored vessels, lifting some completely over wooden piers before smashing them into warehouses farther inland. Smaller fishing boats collide with one another like toys. Heavy cargo ships break their moorings almost instantly, spinning uncontrollably as the current carries them into buildings never intended to withstand such force. Wood splinters, stone cracks, everything begins moving. Water filled with sand, broken timbers, shattered pottery, and fragments of buildings surges through streets that only minutes earlier echoed with ordinary conversation. Unlike river floods, which often rise gradually, this flood possesses momentum, unlike anything most people have ever experienced. It does not simply surround obstacles. It destroys them, Entire market stalls vanish beneath the torrent. Carts loaded with goods overturn and disappear. Stone walls remain standing for only moments before repeated impacts from floating debris weaken their foundations. People who manage to climb onto sturdy rooftops watch helplessly as neighbors struggle in the current below. Some survive by clinging to floating beams. Others vanish beneath the muddy water almost immediately. Then, almost as suddenly as it arrived, the water begins retreating. But the danger has not passed. The returning current drags enormous quantities of debris back toward the sea. Broken ships, roof beams, furniture, animals, everything loose becomes part of the retreating flood. Anyone caught in the current faces another desperate struggle. Many coastal communities experience not one wave, but several. The first is often not the largest. Survivors who cautiously descend from higher ground, believing the danger has ended, sometimes find themselves confronted by another incoming wall of water minutes later. Patience becomes survival. Centuries before scientific explanations existed, ancient societies attempted to understand these terrifying events through stories. A sea that suddenly withdrew before returning with overwhelming force seemed almost supernatural. Religious interpretations naturally followed. Some believed powerful gods had expressed anger. Others viewed the disasters as extraordinary omens announcing political change or divine judgment. Without instruments or geological knowledge, such explanations offered the only framework available. Yet beneath the myths, physical evidence quietly accumulated. Archaeologists working at several ancient coastal settlements have uncovered unusual layers of marine sand lying far inland, mixed with broken shells, fish remains, and fragments of everyday objects. These deposits appear in places where ordinary storms could never have reached. In some locations, entire buildings show signs of sudden destruction followed by rapid abandonment. The sea had briefly crossed the land, then retreated again. One of the most intriguing examples comes from the Bronze Age civilization centered on the island of Crete. Long before the classical civilizations of Greece reached their height, magnificent palaces flourished there, connected by extensive trade routes spanning much of the eastern Mediterranean. Life seemed prosperous, sophisticated, confident. Then, on the nearby island of Thera, known today as Santorini asterisk, one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded human history occurred. The eruption itself darkened skies with ash and pumice. Its consequences extended much farther. Enormous volumes of material collapsed into the sea, generating powerful waves that struck coastlines across the Aegean. Exactly how severely these waves affected the civilization on Crete remains the subject of ongoing scholarly debate. Most historians agree that the eruption caused widespread regional disruption, though it was likely one of several factors influencing later changes rather than the single cause of collapse. History is rarely explained by one disaster alone. Even so, for the people standing on those ancient shores, academic debates held little meaning. They witnessed only the water. Ports that had welcomed merchants from distant kingdoms suddenly became scenes of destruction. Warehouses storing imported goods filled with seawater and mud. Ships representing years of craftsmanship shattered against stone quays. Saltwater contaminated freshwater supplies, creating new hardships long after the flood itself had ended. Recovery demanded extraordinary effort. Harbors required clearing. Buildings needed rebuilding. Trade networks had to be restored. Some communities succeeded. Others gradually faded from regional importance. What makes coastal floods especially haunting is their unpredictability. Farmers beside rivers expected seasonal change. Engineers maintained levees year after year. Coastal settlements, however, could enjoy generations of relative safety before a single morning altered everything. Grandparents had no stories to prepare their grandchildren. There was no memory to inherit, only surprise as Mediterranean civilizations continued expanding. New ports appeared along coastlines stretching from the Levant to southern Europe and North Africa. Each harbor became another meeting place between humanity and the sea. Most days, that meeting remained peaceful. Occasionally, the sea reminded everyone that it had always possessed the final word. While waves reshaped coastlines in the west, far across the Pacific another ancient culture watched entirely different waters. There, seasonal storms gathered with astonishing strength over warm oceans, bringing torrential rain, violent winds, and floods that transformed tropical landscapes into vast networks of rushing rivers. Our journey now turns toward those distant lands, where ancient communities discovered that sometimes the sky alone could unleash enough water to rewrite the history of an entire valley. Far across the Pacific, where dense forests stretched across rugged mountains and humid air carried the scent of wet earth throughout much of the year, ancient communities developed in landscapes shaped by rainfall as much as by rivers. Here, water rarely followed a single predictable channel. It poured from the sky, rushed down steep hillsides, filled winding streams, and spread across broad valleys before eventually reaching the sea. Life adapted to this rhythm. Villages stood upon natural terraces whenever possible. Farmers learned which fields remained productive after seasonal rains and which became dangerous marshes. Paths through the forest changed with the weather. A route that seemed effortless during the dry season could become nearly impossible after only a few days of relentless rain. Generations accepted these challenges. Then came the years when the rain simply refused to end. Modern meteorologists understand that powerful climatic patterns, including what we now call asterisk El Niño, Southern Oscillation asterisk, can dramatically alter rainfall across large regions of the world. Ancient people possessed no such explanation. They observed only the consequences. The clouds gathered earlier. The storms lasted longer. The rivers climbed higher. Imagine waking before dawn in a small farming settlement surrounded by tropical hills more than 2,000 years ago. The sound of rain has become so constant that silence itself feels unfamiliar. For nearly 2 weeks, water has drummed upon woven roofs day and night. Every surface remains damp. Cooking fires require constant attention because dry wood has become increasingly difficult to find. The air feels unusually cool. Mist hangs between the trees. Streams that children once crossed by stepping from stone to stone have become fast-moving torrents, impossible to ford safely. No one speaks much during breakfast. Everyone listens to the rain. At first, the community views the weather with cautious optimism. Crops require water, after all. The surrounding forests appear greener than ever. Small reservoirs fill rapidly. Fish become plentiful in swollen streams. Yet abundance slowly begins transforming into concern. Footpaths disappear beneath muddy water. Simple errands take twice as long. Slopes that once felt solid now shift slightly beneath every step. The hills themselves seem unsettled. Older villagers quietly inspect the mountains each morning. They search not only for rising rivers, but for something equally dangerous. Fresh scars upon the hillsides. Continuous rainfall gradually weakens the ground. Water seeps deep into layers of soil, filling every tiny space between grains of earth. Roots that normally bind the hillside together begin losing their grip as saturated ground grows heavier with each passing day. Nothing dramatic happens, at least not immediately. The mountain waits. Meanwhile, the valley below continues filling with water. Small streams merge into larger channels. Tributaries carrying reddish-brown sediment rush toward the main river, each contributing another measure of force. Fallen branches accumulate against narrow crossings, creating temporary dams that trap water upstream. The pressure quietly increases. Then one obstruction breaks. A surge of water races downstream, carrying logs and broken vegetation toward the village. People notice the sudden change almost immediately. The river, which had risen steadily for days, now climbs far more quickly. Children are called indoors. Livestock are moved toward higher ground. Storage baskets containing precious grain are lifted onto raised platforms. Everyone hopes these precautions will prove unnecessary. Hope cannot change gravity. High upon the surrounding slopes, a section of waterlogged earth finally gives way. There is no warning cry, no visible crack noticed by those below. An entire hillside begins moving. At first, the landslide advances almost silently beneath the trees. Soil, rocks, and uprooted vegetation slide together as a single mass before gathering speed. Larger boulders tumble ahead of the moving earth, smashing through trunks that have stood for centuries. The forest briefly trembles. Then comes the sound. It echoes through the valley, unlike ordinary thunder. A deep, grinding roar. People look toward the mountains. Some see only swirling mist. Others notice trees disappearing one after another. Within moments, the landslide reaches a narrow stream at the base of the slope. The enormous mass temporarily blocks the channel, forcing water to collect behind a newly formed barrier of mud, stone, and shattered timber. For several minutes, an uneasy silence returns. The stream has vanished. Where has the water gone? The answer arrives sooner than anyone expects. The natural dam cannot withstand the growing pressure. Saturated soil collapses under the weight of the trapped water, releasing a powerful flood, carrying everything gathered during the slide. This is no ordinary river. It is a moving landscape. Mud, stones, broken trees, and rushing water combine into a dense torrent capable of crushing almost anything in its path. The leading edge strikes the outskirts of the settlement with astonishing force. Wooden fences vanish instantly. Small storage buildings collapse before anyone inside can react. The thick mixture of mud and debris behaves differently from clear water. It pushes with tremendous weight, surrounding structures, while carrying heavy objects that batter walls repeatedly. People flee toward elevated ground. Running through deep mud proves exhausting. Every step demands effort. Some carry children upon their shoulders. Others support elderly relatives struggling to maintain balance on slippery paths. The flood spreads unevenly across the valley floor. Areas only a few meters higher remain comparatively safe, while lower sections disappear beneath a churning mixture of water and sediment. Fruit trees stand half-buried. Irrigation channels vanish completely beneath fresh deposits of mud. By evening, the rain finally begins to weaken. No one celebrates. The landscape has become almost unrecognizable. Fields carefully cultivated over many seasons now lie beneath thick layers of debris. Familiar paths have disappeared. The river follows a different course than it did only yesterday. Even survivors struggle to understand what they are seeing. Modern archaeological investigations at several ancient sites across Asia and the Pacific have revealed evidence of repeated flood deposits, landslides, and sudden environmental change. Researchers often combine sediment analysis, pollen studies, radiocarbon dating, and geological surveys to reconstruct disasters that occurred thousands of years ago. The Earth remembers, even when written records do not exist. Layers of coarse gravel resting above fine agricultural soils suggest powerful flood events. Buried tree trunks reveal sudden burial beneath landslides. Ancient irrigation systems abruptly ending beneath thick sediment hint that entire farming landscapes were transformed within remarkably short periods. History survives in unexpected places, not only within temples or royal inscriptions, but beneath the ground itself. For the people living through these disasters, rebuilding required extraordinary determination. Mud had to be cleared from homes before repairs could even begin. Wells needed cleaning. Fresh sources of drinking water became essential because stagnant pools quickly attracted insects and contaminated nearby supplies. Food presented another challenge. Fields buried beneath thick debris could not immediately support crops. Seeds stored inside damaged buildings often spoiled after prolonged exposure to moisture. Hunting and fishing temporarily became more important, while agriculture slowly recovered. Communities adapted however they could. Neighbors shared labor. Families combined remaining resources. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next grew, even more valuable than before. People remembered which hills remained stable after prolonged rain. They marked safer routes through the valleys. They rebuilt homes upon slightly higher ground whenever circumstances allowed. These lessons rarely appeared in formal records. They survived through memory, one conversation at a time. Across every civilization we have visited so far, a common thread continues to emerge. Whether beside the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River, the Mediterranean Sea, or the rain-soaked valleys of distant tropical lands, people consistently responded to disaster with remarkable resilience. They mourned, they repaired, they planted again. Human history is not simply a record of catastrophes. It is equally a record of persistence. Yet there remained one ancient flood story, so enduring that echoes of it would spread across continents, appearing in remarkably different cultures, separated by vast distances. It would be told by priests, poets, travelers, and storytellers for thousands of years. Some versions spoke of divine judgment. Others emphasized survival. Nearly all began with the same unforgettable image. The water kept rising, and no one believed it would ever stop. For thousands of years, people have told stories about a flood so immense that it seemed to wash away an entire world. Variations appear across the ancient Near East, the Eastern Mediterranean, parts of South Asia, and far beyond. Although each tradition reflects its own culture, language, and beliefs, they share familiar themes: extraordinary rain, rising rivers, families struggling to survive, a chosen survivor preserving life for the future, mountains emerging from endless water, birds released in search of dry land. These accounts have fascinated historians for centuries. Did they describe one enormous global catastrophe, or did they preserve memories of many devastating regional floods, gradually woven into powerful traditions? Most modern scholars favor the second explanation. Ancient societies experienced repeated floods over thousands of years. Communities remembered the worst disasters. Parents shared those memories with children. Storytellers added meaning. Priests connected events with religious teachings. Over generations, separate experiences often blended into narratives that reached far beyond ordinary history. The stories became larger. The emotions remained genuine. To understand why these traditions proved so enduring, imagine living in a prosperous settlement built upon a wide floodplain somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia. Your grandparents had spoken about severe floods long ago, but many younger adults considered those stories exaggerated. After all, decades had passed without anything comparable. Fields produced reliable harvests. Trade flourished. New homes appeared each year. Confidence slowly replaced caution. The river had been generous for so long that it seemed almost impossible to imagine it becoming truly dangerous again. Then the weather began changing. Not dramatically at first. Spring storms lingered longer than usual across distant mountains. Travelers arriving from upstream reported swollen tributaries and unusually strong currents. Local fishermen noticed floating debris increasing day by day. Riverbanks that normally remained firm throughout the season began crumbling beneath persistent pressure. The changes appeared small. Each one seemed manageable. No single sign suggested catastrophe. Together, however, they formed a pattern. Village elders watched the sky with growing concern. They remembered details that younger generations had never experienced. The peculiar smell carried by floodwater after prolonged rain. The way certain birds abandoned low marshes earlier than expected. The unusual silence among grazing animals shortly before rivers escaped their banks. Experience whispered caution. Optimism answered with doubt. Preparations, therefore, remained limited. Families lifted grain onto higher shelves. Boats were inspected and repaired. Valuable tools were gathered closer to home rather than left scattered across distant fields. Life continued. Markets opened. Children played. Farmers planted as they always had. Meanwhile, far upstream, countless streams merged into rivers already swollen beyond their usual limits. Valleys that had quietly absorbed seasonal runoff finally reached capacity. Every additional storm contributed another surge of water, moving steadily toward the plains. The flood did not hurry. It simply refused to stop. Day after day, the river climbed a little higher. Familiar paths disappeared beneath shallow water. Irrigation canals overflowed until it became difficult to distinguish carefully engineered channels from the river itself. Some families relocated livestock. Others decided to wait. Surely the water would soon level off. Instead, another surge arrived. The river now spread across neighboring fields with alarming speed. Wheat nearing harvest disappeared beneath muddy currents. Orchard trees stood waist deep in water. farmers attempting to rescue equipment found themselves struggling against increasingly powerful flows. Still, many believed their homes would remain safe. The settlement stood slightly above the surrounding farmland. It always had. What no one fully appreciated was that the floodplain itself had changed over generations. Sediment deposited by earlier floods had subtly altered the landscape. Old channels lay hidden beneath cultivated fields. Natural drainage routes remembered by the river had not disappeared. They had merely been forgotten. Water eventually rediscovered them. Late one evening, while most families prepared their final meal before sleep, a distant shout echoed across the settlement. The western embankment had failed. At first, only those living nearby understood the danger. They heard the roar before anyone else. A deep, continuous sound, unlike ordinary flowing water. Torches appeared along the levee as neighbors rushed toward the breach, carrying baskets of earth. The effort lasted only minutes. The current proved overwhelming. A section of the embankment collapsed completely, releasing an immense torrent across the floodplain. People awakened in confusion. Some stepped outside, expecting heavy rain. Instead, they found water racing through streets where children had played only hours earlier. There was no time for careful decisions. Parents gathered sleeping children. Grandparents leaned upon younger relatives. Whatever could be carried quickly was taken. Everything else remained. The flood entered homes with astonishing determination. Doors burst inward beneath the pressure. Storage jars floated across rooms before shattering against walls. Roof beams creaked as saturated foundations began shifting beneath them. Oil lamps flickered. Then darkness swallowed the village. Only moonlight reflected upon moving water. Some families reached boats tied nearby. Others climbed onto flat rooftops. Hopping the highest structures would remain above the flood. Neighbors called out to one another through the darkness, their voices nearly drowned by the relentless current. Hours passed. Rain continued. The river kept rising. By dawn, the settlement had become a scattered collection of rooftops, surrounded by an endless sheet of brown water. Trees protruded like lonely islands. Livestock drifted downstream, alongside broken carts, sections of fencing, and fragments of homes that had sheltered generations. No one knew how large the disaster truly was. Perhaps only their village had suffered. Perhaps neighboring towns remained untouched. Perhaps the entire world had disappeared beneath the flood. From the perspective of a survivor, isolated upon a rooftop, or crowded into a small wooden boat, such questions were impossible to answer. The horizon offered only water. This limitation of human perspective helps explain why ancient flood traditions became so powerful. A regional catastrophe affecting hundreds of square kilometers could easily appear limitless to those living through it. Without maps, aerial views, or long-distance communication, survivors judged events only by what they could personally witness. Their world had vanished. Whether distant lands remained, safe hardly changed that emotional reality. Eventually, as all floods do, the water began retreating. Not suddenly, gradually. Each day revealed another piece of familiar ground, emerging beneath thick layers of fresh sediment. Recovery brought its own challenges. Homes required rebuilding from their foundations. Wells had to be cleaned before fresh water could safely be drawn again. Fields needed careful inspection because fertile silt often lay beside deep deposits of coarse sand and gravel, unsuitable for immediate planting. The disaster had ended. Its consequences had only begun. Children growing up afterward listened carefully whenever older relatives described those frightening weeks. Every detail mattered. Where the safest hill stood, which trees remained above the flood, how birds returned before people dared descend from higher ground, which neighbors shared food despite their own shortages. Memory gradually transformed into instruction. Instruction slowly became tradition. Tradition eventually entered myth. This process did not diminish the historical reality of flooding. If anything, it preserved emotional truths that official records often ignored. Royal inscriptions usually celebrated rebuilding. Temple texts praised divine protection. Ordinary families remembered fear. They remembered waiting. They remembered the silence after the water finally withdrew. Modern archaeology occasionally uncovers settlements buried beneath flood deposits that correspond remarkably well with these recurring patterns. Thick layers of river sediment separate periods of occupation. Rebuilt houses stand directly above earlier foundations. Everyday objects remain exactly where hurried owners abandoned them. A child's clay toy, a broken grinding stone, a cooking pot still resting beside an ancient hearth. None of these objects speak, yet together they quietly confirm that floods shaped countless ordinary lives throughout antiquity. The greatest lesson preserved by these ancient disasters is perhaps not about destruction itself. It is about adaptation. Civilizations rarely survived because they eliminated floods. They survived because they learned to live beside them. Engineers improved canals. Communities strengthened levees. Farmers adjusted planting seasons. Builders raised foundations. Storytellers passed knowledge across generations. Every improvement represented another conversation between humanity and nature. The conversation never truly ended. As centuries passed, new kingdoms rose where older ones had fallen. Rivers shifted course. Coastlines changed. Forests expanded and retreated. Yet the same fundamental relationship endured. Water remained life's greatest gift, and when conditions aligned, its most relentless adversary. Our journey through the deadliest floods of the ancient world is now approaching another turning point, where the focus shifts from individual disasters to the remarkable ways ancient civilizations rebuilt themselves after losing nearly everything. That recovery, slow and often overlooked, would become one of history's greatest demonstrations of human endurance. Across the ancient world, rebuilding after a catastrophic flood demanded far more than replacing damaged buildings. Entire communities had to rediscover ordinary life. The routines that once seemed effortless, drawing clean water, baking bread, tending livestock, repairing tools, and planting crops, suddenly became complicated tasks requiring patience and cooperation. The flood had passed. Its shadow remained. When survivors first returned to their settlements, silence often greeted them. Streets that once echoed with conversation now lay buried beneath uneven layers of mud. Familiar landmarks had disappeared. Wooden fences marking family property had floated away. Orchard rows no longer formed straight lines because the current had uprooted trees or buried them beneath fresh sediment. People paused frequently, not because they had forgotten where they lived, because the landscape itself no longer matched memory. Imagine arriving home after weeks spent on higher ground. The path leading toward your house no longer exists. Instead, a shallow channel winds across what had once been farmland. Every step sinks into damp earth. Broken reeds lie tangled around tree trunks several meters above normal water level, silently revealing just how high the flood had climbed. Your home still stands. Barely. The lower walls have softened after prolonged exposure to water. Sections of the roof have collapsed beneath their own weight. The doorway remains blocked by thick mud mixed with reeds, branches, and shattered pottery carried from neighboring houses. Nothing inside appears familiar. Clay storage jars lie broken across the floor. Grinding stones weigh half buried beneath drying sediment. Furniture has shifted into strange positions, as though invisible hands rearranged the room. The house survived. Life inside it did not. Cleaning began immediately, not because people wished to restore comfort, because survival depended upon it. Mud left inside buildings hardened quickly beneath the returning sun. Every day of delay made removal more difficult. Families therefore worked from sunrise until dusk, carrying basket after basket of wet earth outside. Children helped despite their small size. Elderly relatives sorted anything that remained usable. Neighbors moved from one house to another, understanding that no family could complete the task alone. The flood had demonstrated how vulnerable everyone truly was. Recovery reminded them how necessary cooperation remained. One of the greatest concerns involved drinking water. Wells that had served communities faithfully for generations often became contaminated during major floods. Mud, decaying vegetation, and waste entered water supplies hidden beneath the ground. Clear-looking water could no longer be trusted. Ancient people possessed no knowledge of microscopic organisms. They understood something simpler: water that tasted wrong, water that smelled unusual, water followed by sickness. Communities therefore cleaned wells with remarkable care. Buckets removed contaminated water again and again until fresh groundwater gradually replaced it. Stones lining the shafts were inspected for damage. Sometimes, entirely new wells had to be dug when older ones proved unsafe. It was exhausting work, but absolutely essential. Food created another challenge. Grains stored in elevated rooms occasionally survived intact, rewarding families who had prepared carefully before the flood arrived. Others found their harvest ruined by moisture or contaminated by mud. Spoiled grain represented more than hunger. It represented lost time. Another growing season would be required before supplies could be replaced. Sharing, therefore, became common in many communities. Archaeologists cannot always see generosity preserved within the ground. Yet human societies throughout history repeatedly survived difficult years through cooperation rather than isolation. A family whose storage remained dry helped another whose supplies had been destroyed. Neighbors exchanged labor instead of wealth. Communities organized collective repairs before individual improvements. Survival rarely belonged to those acting alone. The flood had reminded everyone of that truth. Farmers soon turned their attention toward the fields. At first glance, the situation often appeared hopeless. Thick blankets of fresh sediment covered carefully prepared farmland. Irrigation ditches had vanished beneath deposits of silt. Boundary markers separating one family's land from another could no longer be found. Yet appearances proved deceptive. Floods destroyed. They also renewed. Fine layers of nutrient-rich silt frequently transformed exhausted fields into remarkably fertile ground once the excess moisture disappeared. Farmers who understood their rivers recognized this paradox well. A disastrous flood one year sometimes produced exceptional harvests the next, provided the land could first be reclaimed. That process required endless labor. Canals filled with sediment had to be cleared by hand. Small embankments required rebuilding. Drainage channels needed reopening before waterlogged fields could dry sufficiently for planting. Every basket of earth removed represented another small step toward normal life. Ancient rulers understood the importance of these efforts. Throughout Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and other river civilizations, inscriptions frequently celebrated the restoration of irrigation systems after destructive floods. Kings proudly announced repaired canals and strengthened levees because they recognized that agriculture formed the foundation of political stability. Without harvests, cities weakened. Without irrigation, harvests failed. Restoring water management, therefore, became one of the first responsibilities after major disasters. Ordinary workers accomplished most of that labor. Their names rarely appeared in inscriptions. Their footprints disappeared beneath later generations. Yet every surviving civilization depended upon their determination. Builders also learned valuable lessons from repeated flooding. In many settlements, archaeologists have discovered that later houses stood upon higher foundations than earlier ones. Floors were raised. Streets gradually climbed above previous levels. Entire neighborhoods slowly became elevated through centuries of rebuilding. No grand master plan directed these changes. They accumulated one repair at a time. A family rebuilding after one flood decided to add another layer of packed earth beneath the new floor. Their children repeated the practice decades later. Their grandchildren raised the house once again after another disaster. Over centuries, settlements literally grew upward. History became layered beneath people's feet. Excavating ancient cities today often resembles reading a book whose pages consist of soil rather than paper. Each occupation level tells a different chapter: a peaceful generation, a destructive flood, reconstruction, another flood, another recovery. The sequence repeats with remarkable consistency across many ancient civilizations. Nature interrupted. Humanity continued. Floods also influenced memory in quieter ways. Parents taught children never to ignore unusual river behavior. Grandparents pointed toward distant hills while explaining where earlier generations had found safety. Stories accompanied practical advice, not to frighten, to prepare. Many customs that later seemed symbolic probably originated from lived experience. Storing emergency grain, keeping boats repaired even during calm years, building shrines upon elevated ground, marking exceptional flood levels upon stone or timber. These practices reflected observation accumulated across lifetimes. Experience became tradition. Tradition strengthened resilience. Even so, no amount of preparation eliminated uncertainty. A flood matching every previous expectation could suddenly become something entirely different. An embankment that had held for generations might fail without warning. A river following the same channel for centuries could unexpectedly carve another path across the plain. Ancient people understood this better than modern observers sometimes imagine. They respected water precisely because they knew it could never be fully controlled. Perhaps that is why so many civilizations described rivers almost as living beings rather than simple geographical features. The Nile arrived. The Yellow River wandered. The Tigris and Euphrates rewarded or punished. These expressions reflected more than poetry. They acknowledged uncertainty. Today, satellites observe storms forming across oceans. Engineers monitor reservoirs using sophisticated instruments. Meteorologists forecast heavy rainfall days in advance. Massive dams regulate rivers that once flooded without restraint. Yet, despite extraordinary technological progress, modern societies still experience devastating floods. The locations have changed. The tools have changed. Human vulnerability has not disappeared. Studying the floods of the ancient world, therefore, reveals something larger than history alone. It reminds us that civilizations have always existed through a delicate partnership with nature. Rivers create fertile valleys, sustain trade, nourish crops, and support great cities. They also retain the power to reshape those same landscapes within remarkably short periods. The ancient survivors, whose stories we have followed, possessed neither modern science nor advanced machinery. What they did possess was persistence. Again and again, they returned. Again and again, they rebuilt. Again and again, they planted seeds into soil left behind by disaster, trusting that another harvest would eventually come. That quiet determination may be the greatest legacy left by the deadliest floods of the ancient world. Their monuments were not only temples, palaces, or city walls. They were the generations who refused to abandon the rivers that had both sustained and challenged them for thousands of years. The passing of time has a remarkable way of softening even the greatest disasters. A child born 20 years after a catastrophic flood grows up hearing stories rather than remembering fear. 50 years later, many of the damaged buildings have long been repaired. Fresh orchards bear fruit where tangled debris once covered the ground. Markets become lively again. Children laugh in streets rebuilt by parents who once believed those same streets had disappeared forever beneath muddy water. Life quietly resumes. Normality returns so gradually that people scarcely notice it happening. This pattern repeated itself throughout the ancient world. Whether beside the Nile, the Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River, or countless smaller waterways, whose names history has forgotten. Each generation inherited a landscape shaped by floods experienced by those who came before. Many warning signs survived. Others slowly faded. Imagine a young farmer growing up several decades after a devastating flood. He has heard his grandfather describe the disaster many times. The old man always pauses at the same moment in the story. The water reached that hill. The grandson looks toward the hill. It seems impossible. The distance appears far too great. The fields between the village and the hillside now produce healthy crops every year. Birds nest peacefully among the reeds. Narrow irrigation canals carry water exactly where it is needed. Nothing about the landscape suggests that an immense flood once transformed the valley into an inland sea. The young farmer smiles politely. Surely memory has exaggerated the truth. The grandfather notices the expression. Without speaking, he walks toward a weathered stone, standing alone beside an old footpath. its lower surface remains buried beneath centuries of soil. Near the top, a faint line has been carved. The old man places his hand upon it. The river stood here. No one knows who first carved the mark. Perhaps someone who survived. Perhaps someone who helped rebuild afterward. Perhaps someone determined that future generations should never forget. Across many civilizations, people sought ways to preserve memories of extraordinary floods. Sometimes they carved marks upon rocks or temple walls. Sometimes priests recorded unusually high water levels in official documents. In other places, songs and oral traditions carried the memory instead. Not every warning survived equally well. Stone outlasted voices. Voices adapted more easily than stone. Both shaped history. Ancient Egypt offers one of the clearest examples of systematic observation. Officials carefully measured the annual rise of the Nile because the river determined taxation, harvest expectations, and food security across the kingdom. The height of each inundation mattered enormously. A modest flood promised adequate crops. A weak flood threatened famine. An exceptionally high flood warned of destruction. Generation after generation, these observations gradually created one of humanity's earliest long-term environmental records. The people making those measurements could not predict every future flood. They could recognize patterns. That distinction proved valuable. Elsewhere, similar knowledge developed through experience rather than formal measurement. Fishermen noticed subtle differences in currents. Boat builders understood which stretches of shoreline remained safest during storms. Farmers observed how certain plants flourished after unusually wet seasons, while others struggled. Knowledge accumulated quietly. No single individual possessed all of it. Communities did. This shared understanding became one of civilization's greatest defenses against natural disaster, not because it eliminated danger, because it reduced surprise. Even architecture reflected these lessons. Archaeologists have discovered settlements where builders deliberately raised important structures upon artificial platforms. Temples often occupied elevated ground. Public granaries sometimes stood above ordinary houses. Storage rooms were constructed with thicker walls or higher entrances designed to reduce damage during seasonal flooding. These choices were practical before they became symbolic. Religion and engineering often occupied the same space in the ancient world. Protecting sacred places also protected communities. Protecting grain protected survival itself. The relationship between flooding and agriculture remained deeply complicated. Modern readers sometimes imagine floods as purely destructive events. Yet ancient farmers understood a more nuanced reality. Without seasonal flooding, many fertile valleys would gradually lose their productivity. Without rivers carrying fresh sediment, soils eventually became exhausted The challenge, therefore, lay not in preventing every flood. It lay in surviving the exceptional ones. This delicate balance shaped countless decisions. Where should a new village be built? How close should fields extend toward the river? How high should embankments rise? Which crops recovered most quickly after inundation? Every answer reflected generations of observation. Sometimes those answers proved correct. Sometimes nature introduced entirely new conditions. Climate itself changed over centuries. Long periods of stable weather occasionally gave way to decades of greater uncertainty. Some rivers shifted course. Others experienced unusually frequent flooding. Droughts alternated with seasons of abundant rainfall. Ancient societies rarely recognized these gradual climatic changes as single events. They experienced them one harvest at a time, one unusually wet year, one disappointing harvest, one successful recovery. History moved quietly. Modern scientists reconstruct many of these ancient environmental changes using methods unimaginable to the people who originally lived through them. Sediment cores extracted from lake beds preserve tiny grains of pollen, revealing which plants dominated different periods. Tree rings record years of plentiful rainfall and years of drought. Layers of river deposits reveal repeated flooding, stretching back thousands of years. The landscape has become an archive. Each layer preserves another sentence in a story written not by kings or scribes, but by rivers, storms, and time itself. When archaeologists carefully excavate ancient flood deposits, they often uncover remarkably ordinary objects. A woven basket flattened beneath silt, a bronze knife resting beside an unfinished meal, children's toys abandoned in courtyards. These discoveries rarely belong to famous rulers. They belong to ordinary families. That may be why they feel so familiar. Across thousands of years, people responded to disaster in surprisingly recognizable ways. Parents protected children before possessions. Neighbors searched for one another after the water receded. Communities rebuilt together because rebuilding alone proved nearly impossible. Technology changes. Human nature changes much more slowly. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the ancient world's deadliest floods is not their destructive power, but humanity's refusal to surrender to them. Again and again, rivers erased years of labor. Again and again, people began anew. A canal cleared, a wall repaired, a field replanted, a roof rebuilt. These actions rarely appeared dramatic. Taken together, they sustained civilizations for millennia. Without that persistence, the great cities of antiquity would never have endured long enough to leave temples, inscriptions, and artifacts for later generations to discover. Every ancient monument standing today owes something to unnamed laborers who recovered after disasters history barely recorded. Their work extended beyond construction. They preserved continuity. They ensured that knowledge survived alongside buildings. As our journey through the ancient world's deadliest floods continues, we will soon encounter another fascinating question. What happened when floods combined with famine, disease, and political instability at the same time? History shows that one disaster alone often challenged civilizations. Several arriving together could transform the course of entire kingdoms, and those overlapping crises would shape some of the most remarkable survival stories the ancient world ever witnessed. History rarely unfolds through a single catastrophe. More often, disasters arrive one after another, each making recovery from the previous hardship more difficult. A flood destroys the harvest. Food becomes scarce. Malnutrition weakens the population. Illness spreads more easily. Trade slows because merchants have little surplus to exchange. Political leaders struggle to organize relief, while neighboring regions face similar problems of their own. One crisis opens the door, another quietly walks through it. Ancient societies understood this reality, even if they lacked the scientific language to describe it. A devastating flood rarely ended when the water disappeared. In many ways, that was merely the beginning. Imagine a prosperous farming district along one of the great rivers several months after an enormous flood. The fields have finally dried enough for planting. Families have repaired the worst damage to their homes. Children once again run through narrow lanes between houses. At first glance, the settlement appears to have recovered. Appearances can be misleading. The previous harvest was lost. The grain stored for winter has been greatly reduced. Seeds saved for planting are fewer than usual because many were eaten simply to survive. Every family faces difficult choices. Should more grain be consumed now to avoid hunger, or should it be preserved for planting? Risking immediate hardship in exchange for future harvests. There is no perfect answer. Every decision carries consequences. A father studies the remaining baskets of grain inside his home. The supply looks substantial from a distance. Closer inspection reveals the truth. Only a fraction remains. He calculates carefully. If the family eats normally, the grain will not last until the next harvest. If everyone eats less, they may have enough seed to plant a larger field when the season arrives. Neither option feels safe. Similar conversations unfold throughout the village. Ancient communities depended heavily upon cooperation during years like these. Families exchanged labor instead of goods. Those with surviving livestock helped neighbors plow damaged fields. Fishermen shared part of their catch with households whose crops had failed completely. Craftsmen repaired broken tools without demanding immediate payment, trusting that future harvests would eventually restore balance. Mutual support became a form of insurance, not written on papyrus, not carved into stone, practiced quietly through daily life. Yet even the strongest community could not solve every problem. Floods frequently damaged food storage facilities. Moisture entered granaries through cracked walls or weakened roofs. Grain that appeared perfectly healthy from the outside often spoiled internally. Mold spread slowly, unnoticed, until precious supplies had already become unsafe to consume. People opened storage jars, expecting relief. Instead, they found disappointment. Every ruined basket represented weeks of labor, lost forever. Meanwhile, stagnant pools left behind by retreating floodwaters created ideal conditions for insects. Mosquitoes multiplied rapidly. Drinking water remained difficult to protect from contamination. Domestic animals crowded onto the same elevated ground used by people during the flood, increasing opportunities for disease to spread. Ancient physicians observed patterns. They recognized that illness often followed flooding. They simply did not understand why. A child who survived the rushing water might fall sick several weeks later. An elderly farmer who helped rebuild homes could suddenly become too weak to work. Entire households occasionally found themselves caring for multiple ill family members, while simultaneously trying to restore damaged fields. Recovery slowed, not because people lacked determination, because exhaustion accumulated. The body has limits, so does every society. Political leaders throughout the ancient world faced enormous pressure during difficult years. Their responsibilities extended far beyond collecting taxes or leading armies. They organized labor for repairing canals, distributing stored grain, rebuilding levees, and restoring transportation routes essential for trade. Success strengthened public confidence. Failure invited criticism. In some ancient kingdoms, rulers proudly recorded successful flood relief projects upon stone monuments. They described newly constructed embankments, restored irrigation channels, and generous distributions of grain. Such inscriptions naturally emphasized achievements rather than mistakes, yet they reveal something important. People expected action. Disaster management formed part of good government long before the phrase itself existed. Not every leader met those expectations. Sometimes resources proved insufficient. Sometimes floods affected several regions simultaneously, leaving few unaffected communities able to provide assistance. Sometimes political disputes delayed necessary repairs. Nature cared little for human disagreements. A damaged canal remained damaged regardless of who claimed responsibility. Trade networks often determined whether a flood became a temporary hardship or a prolonged crisis. If neighboring regions enjoyed successful harvests, merchants could transport grain into affected areas. Prices remained high, but famine might be avoided. When floods struck widely, however, opportunities narrowed. Everyone required food. Few possessed surplus. Ancient caravans moved slowly. Riverboats depended upon navigable channels. Mountain routes became dangerous after prolonged rain. Distance itself became another obstacle, even where help existed. Reaching those in need demanded time. Archaeologists studying ancient settlements frequently notice periods when rebuilding progressed unevenly. Large public structures sometimes recovered quickly, while ordinary homes remained damaged for years. In other places, humble villages demonstrated remarkable resilience despite limited resources, because local cooperation compensated for the absence of centralized authority. There was no single pattern. Human responses proved as varied as the landscapes themselves. One particularly fascinating aspect of flood recovery involves memory passed between generations. Children who experienced disaster firsthand often became adults unusually attentive to environmental warning signs. They noticed subtle changes in river color. They recognized unfamiliar sounds carried by rising water during the night. They remembered exactly how quickly a harmless-looking stream could transform into a dangerous torrent. Experience sharpened observation. Observation improved survival. By contrast, grandchildren born decades later sometimes viewed those warnings with understandable skepticism. The landscape appeared peaceful once again. Repaired embankments seemed permanent. Newly planted orchards flourished. Markets bustled. Disaster gradually became history. History slowly became story. Story occasionally became legend. This cycle repeated across civilizations, separated by thousands of kilometers. Modern researchers call this phenomenon the fadding of disaster memory. Ancient communities simply recognized that people who had not witnessed catastrophe often underestimated its possibility. The river had not changed. Human confidence had. Every generation, therefore, faced the same challenge. How could knowledge of past floods remain meaningful during long periods of calm? Some societies answered by maintaining annual rituals connected with rivers. Others preserved detailed observations through official records. Many relied upon oral traditions, ensuring that grandparents repeatedly shared memories with grandchildren until the stories became part of community identity. These conversations mattered, not because they predicted every future flood, because they reminded people that safety should never be taken for granted. Standing today beside many of the world's great rivers, it can be difficult to imagine the ancient disasters they once unleashed. Modern dams, levees, reservoirs, bridges, and forecasting systems have transformed countless landscapes. Cities stretch across floodplains where earlier generations hesitated to settle permanently. The rivers appear tamed. Appearances can deceive. Even now, extraordinary rainfall occasionally reminds modern societies that complete control remains an illusion. Engineers reduce risk. They cannot eliminate nature. The ancient world understood this lesson through experience rather than theory. Every flood left behind more than mud. It left behind wisdom. Some of that wisdom survives today in archaeological layers, weathered inscriptions, forgotten myths, and landscapes still shaped by rivers that continue flowing exactly as they did thousands of years ago. The people themselves are gone. Their cities may lie in ruins. Their voices have long since fallen silent. Yet every spring when mountain snow melts, every summer when seasonal rains gather, and every autumn when rivers quietly rise, the same ancient conversation between humanity and water begins once again. It is a conversation that has never truly ended. The story of the ancient world's deadliest floods does not end with the final retreat of the water. In many ways, it continues every time archaeologists uncover another buried village, every time geologists identify an ancient layer of river sediment, and every time historians compare the flood traditions preserved by civilizations separated by thousands of kilometers. The rivers continue flowing. The evidence continues waiting. Beneath modern cities, beneath cultivated farmland, and beneath quiet stretches of countryside, countless traces of forgotten disasters remain hidden. A thin band of mud between occupation layers. A collapsed wall preserved exactly where it fell. A collection of broken pottery sealed beneath flood deposits before anyone could recover it. Each discovery adds another small piece to a much larger story. No single flood shaped the ancient world. Thousands did. Some lasted only hours. Others transformed entire regions for generations. Some entered royal inscriptions. Most survived only within the memories of ordinary people, whose names history never recorded. That quiet reality may be the most remarkable lesson of all. History often celebrates kings, generals, and monumental buildings. Yet civilizations endured because countless unnamed families refused to surrender after disaster. They repaired canals by hand. They rebuilt homes one brick at a time. They replanted orchards whose trees had been swept away. They taught their children where the safest ground lay and how to recognize the earliest warning signs carried by changing rivers. Their determination became the true foundation of civilization. Without those repeated acts of resilience, no kingdom could have survived long enough to build temples, write histories, or establish lasting traditions. Modern science now allows us to understand these ancient disasters with extraordinary detail. Satellite imagery traces abandoned river channels invisible from the ground. Sediment cores reveal floods that occurred thousands of years before written history. Radiocarbon dating helps reconstruct timelines once thought impossible to recover. Computer models estimate the force of ancient floodwaters across valleys that have changed dramatically over time. Yet, despite all of these remarkable advances, one truth remains unchanged. The people living through those floods did not know they would become part of history. They believed they were simply trying to survive another difficult season. That perspective deserves remembering when we read about a settlement buried beneath several meters of silt. It is easy to think in terms of archaeology, the people living their thought about dinner, about protecting their children, about finding clean water, about repairing a roof before the next rain arrived. History becomes far more meaningful when viewed through their eyes. Throughout this journey, we have traveled beside the rivers of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates sustained some of humanity's earliest cities while occasionally overwhelming them. We stood along the Nile, whose dependable rhythm nourished Egypt for millennia, yet sometimes exceeded every expectation. We visited the carefully planned settlements of the Indus Valley, where remarkable engineering met equally remarkable monsoon floods. We watched the Yellow River reshape entire landscapes beneath astonishing quantities of fertile silt. We witnessed the Mediterranean Sea suddenly withdraw before returning as devastating waves. We crossed rain-soaked valleys where landslides transformed mountains into rivers of mud and stone. Different landscapes, different cultures, different centuries, one shared experience. Every civilization learned that water could never be treated merely as a resource. It was a force, a partner, a challenge, sometimes a destroyer, often a provider, always deserving respect. Perhaps that explains why rivers occupied such an important place within ancient belief systems. They represented more than geography. They symbolized renewal after hardship, continuity despite change, and the delicate balance upon which every harvest depended. Ancient people never possessed complete control over nature. Neither do we. The tools have improved. The understanding has deepened. The relationship itself remains remarkably familiar. Today, modern flood forecasting, engineering, and emergency planning save countless lives every year. Yet, extraordinary floods continue to remind us that rivers still follow their own logic. Climate continues changing. Storms continue forming over distant mountains. Coastlines continue evolving. The ancient world is not as distant as it sometimes appears. Its lessons continue flowing around us. So the next time you stand beside a quiet river, watch sunlight reflecting gently across the surface, or cross a bridge without giving the water below much thought. Remember that the same peaceful current may have witnessed thousands of years of human hope, fear, rebuilding, and perseverance, long before maps, long before weather forecasts, long before history books. People stood on those same banks, wondering whether the river would bring life or loss. Sometimes it brought both, and perhaps that is the greatest legacy left by the deadliest floods of the ancient world. Not simply the destruction they caused, but the extraordinary resilience they revealed. Generation after generation, century after century, civilization endured because ordinary people always found the strength to begin again. Thank you for joining this long journey through one of history's most powerful natural forces. May the stories of those forgotten communities remind us that even the greatest disasters eventually give way to recovery, memory, and hope. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.